Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Benjamin Franklin is one of my favorite historical figures, and today I'm pleased to speak to you about his role as a pioneer of insurance in North America. This portrait of Benjamin Franklin that you see here was painted by David Martin in 1767. It is my favorite portrait of Franklin because it truly depicts him as a paragon of the 18th century age of enlightenment. Indeed, Franklin embodied the Enlightenment outlook in seeking to use reason to improve the human condition in a myriad of possible respects. He was a self-made man who created his own fortune. He was a polymath, a renowned wit, and a freethinker. He always followed his own reasoning and his own conscience in arriving at his ideas. He did not blindly accept the teachings of the established authorities of his day. He did not blindly accept convention just because it was conventional. And he branched out into so many disciplines. He was a printer, a successful businessman, an inventor, a philosopher, a scientist, a diplomat, a statesman, a revolutionary, and, most relevant for the purposes of this presentation, a firefighter and an insurance innovator. He was born in Boston in 1706, and he was the 10th of 17 children. His father was a soap maker, and Benjamin, at a young age, was apprenticed to his older brother James, who was a printer. However, Benjamin did not get along with James, nor did he get along with the Puritan authorities of colonial Massachusetts. So eventually those differences led Benjamin to decide to run away from home at the age of 17 and seek his fortunes elsewhere. He ended up in colonial Philadelphia, which at that time was part of the proprietorship of Pennsylvania, held by the Penn family. The Penn family were Quakers. They believed in peace, they supported tolerance of dissent, and therefore Benjamin Franklin, as a young man, was able to enjoy freedom of speech in Philadelphia. As a printer, he could enjoy freedom of the press. He purchased a failing newspaper, renamed it the Pennsylvania Gazette, and used it as a platform to promote many of his other multifaceted ideas and projects. In 1727, at the age of 21, he founded the Junto, which grew to be a club of 12 young men who would meet regularly and discuss various ideas for self-improvement, as well as concepts in the realms of morality, politics, natural philosophy, and practical innovation. They connected all of these realms together and deployed their insights for the purpose of improving the human condition. Many of Benjamin Franklin's associates from the Junto would go on to join him in many of his later endeavors. One of the key issues of the time that Benjamin Franklin directed a lot of his attention toward was the problem of fire. In fact, it was a far more devastating problem than it is today, since cities of the early modern era were predominantly constructed out of wood, and the buildings were situated in close proximity so as to provide physical security against invaders. Furthermore, the principal methods of providing heat and fuel involved many open fires. Common sources of heat and fuel were wood, coal, and candles, and any of these had the potential to very readily set a building on fire. Periodic major fires would begin in one building and extend to wipe out the vast majority of even a large metropolitan area. A famous example of this was the Great Fire of London in 1666, which consumed 7/8 of that city. Philadelphia, in the early 18th century, enjoyed some advantages relative to most cities of that era, It was more recently founded, more modern in construction, mostly brick and stone buildings. The streets were broader, and the population was less numerous than in many large cities of the time. Indeed, the population was about 12,000 in 1731, and it grew to about 28,522 in 1790. So this center of commerce and culture of the 18th century was substantially smaller than even many small cities and towns in the United States are today. However, in spite of Philadelphia's advantages for its time, devastating fires still occurred. And one such fire was a formative experience for young Benjamin Franklin. It occurred when he was 24, and he had the occasion to write about it in the April 30th, 1730 issue of the Pennsylvania Gazette. He wrote, "On Friday night last, about 11 o'clock, a fire broke out in a store near Mr. Fishbourne's wharf, and before it could be mastered, consumed all the stores, etc., on the wharf, damaged several houses on that side of the street, and crossing the way, seized the fine house of Mr. J. Dickinson, with 2 other houses adjoining towards Walnut Street, which are all ruined. The loss in the whole is supposed to be 4,000 or 5,000 pounds English sterling. It is thought that if the people had been provided with good fire engines and other suitable instruments, the fire might easily have been prevented spreading, as there was but little wind. There is now a subscription on foot for supplying the town with everything necessary of that nature, which meets with great encouragement. There was much thieving at the fire, and several ill persons are now in prison on that account." And one can see in that passage a great deal of perceptiveness from young Benjamin Franklin. Not only was he able to catalog the devastation of the fire and the methods that the community of Philadelphia at that time had to combat it, but he also understood the adverse secondary consequences that fires could bring about. The theft, the vandalism, the breakdown of social order, all of which made it all the more imperative to seek to prevent fires and develop a more effective response to them. And as a true representative of the 18th century Enlightenment, Benjamin Franklin set forth in applying his reason and personally becoming involved in the solution to the problem. On February 4th, 1735, writing as an anonymous old citizen at the age of 29, Benjamin Franklin penned an editorial in the Pennsylvania Gazette, and in it he wrote to suggest a club or society of active men belonging to each fire engine, whose business is to attend all fires with it whenever they happen. And Benjamin Franklin would actually do this often. He would adopt various personas for the purpose of articulating his ideas in print. And this editorial was quite amusing in certain respects. Writing as this old gentleman, Franklin offered some interesting fire safety advice. He wrote, "In the first place, as an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure," by the way, that is the origin of that saying, "I would advise them to take care how they suffer living coals in a full shovel, to be carried out of one room into another, or up or down stairs, unless in a warming pan shut. For scraps of fire may fall into chinks, and make no appearance until midnight, when your stairs being in flames you may be forced, as I once was, to leap out of your windows, and hazard your necks to avoid being oven roasted." Now, I don't know if this episode actually happened to Benjamin Franklin personally, or whether this was the old citizen persona relating a fictional account. Nonetheless, this column proved to be quite influential, and it attracted public interest enough that Benjamin Franklin was able to found the Union Fire Company on December 7th, 1736. This was the first volunteer fire company in Philadelphia. And the portrait you see here was not a contemporary portrait of Benjamin Franklin. It was painted in 1850 by Charles Washington Wright. However, the young Benjamin Franklin as a firefighter could have looked this way. The composition of volunteer fire companies was primarily made of affluent individuals, men of property, who provided and maintained their own equipment. Equipment at that time was rather basic. It included leather buckets for carrying water, baskets, ladders, hooks, what were called fire engines, which were really hand-cranked water pumps. These volunteers met approximately once a month in order to discuss firefighting tactics and prevention. This proved to be a popular concept, and Benjamin Franklin received a lot of interest from others to join the Union Fire Company. But in fact, Benjamin Franklin never liked for the endeavors that he was individually involved in to grow too large or unwieldy. And therefore, instead of just growing his particular volunteer fire company, he encouraged others to emulate it and to form their own. And as a result, many volunteer fire companies emerged in Philadelphia during the subsequent 2 decades. One common misconception that it is important to dispel is the myth that the volunteer firefighters would only respond to fires on their own properties or on the properties of those who subscribed or donated to the fire company in some way. And that was definitely not the case. The firefighters responded to fires at any properties because it was understood that a fire at one building could readily spread to others and engulf the entire city. As a result of the efforts of these volunteer fire companies in providing a more organized response to fires, Philadelphia became one of the safest cities from the standpoint of fire risk in the 18th century. But Benjamin Franklin did not stop there. Indeed, much of his activity as an inventor and discoverer was oriented toward preventing and mitigating this hazard of fire. The Franklin stove, invented in 1742, was a tremendous improvement over the open fireplaces that predominated prior to that time. Unlike the open fireplaces, many of which were even framed by wood, such that an ember that escaped from the fireplace could essentially very readily set the surroundings on fire. The Franklin stove was a cast iron furnace. It was able to absorb and retain heat more efficiently than a conventional fireplace. It used less wood. It emitted less smoke. And, most importantly, from the standpoint of fire safety, it prevented those embers from leaping out. Franklin's famous writings and experiments in electricity were also motivated by the desire to reduce the risk of fire. Franklin discovered that lightning is indeed electricity. He articulated the principle of conservation of charge, and contrary to the common notion at that time that electricity consisted of 2 currents, a positive current and a distinct negative current, Franklin recognized that electricity is in fact a single current flowing from positively to negatively charged objects. In 1752, the same year that he conducted his famous kite experiment, Franklin developed the first lightning rod, in which he harnessed this newfound knowledge of electricity. Essentially, the lightning rod is a rod connected to the ground by a wire, which is able to channel the electrical current safely away from the house and into the ground. And this invention saved many houses from fires caused by lightning. But ultimately, even the best fire prevention efforts can only go so far. Benjamin Franklin recognized the need for a mechanism to effectively cover the costs of those fires which did arise in spite of the best efforts. To this end, in 1752, Franklin founded the Philadelphia Contributorship for the insuring of houses from loss by fire. I am quite fond of these highly descriptive 18th century names, because by just seeing a name such as this, one can clearly understand exactly what that enterprise was about. The first meeting of the Philadelphia Contributorship was held on May 11th, 1752, and actually for the first 84 years of its existence, the Contributorship did not have its own office. The office building you see on this slide was constructed in 1836. Prior to that, meetings occurred periodically in various taverns in Philadelphia and in the houses of various subscribers and directors of the Philadelphia Contributorship. During this first meeting, an enormous 44-foot single parchment containing the deed of settlement was signed by approximately a tenth of the population of Philadelphia at that time. It contained 1,774 signatures in total. The first signature was that of Pennsylvania Governor James Hamilton, showing that this endeavor actually had support at the highest levels of colonial government. The second signature was that of Benjamin Franklin himself. And this was the first fire insurance company in North America. It was a mutual insurance company. Subscribers agreed to be and continue to be contributors unto and equal sharers in the losses as well as the gains. The policies issued by the contributorship offered more limited coverage than property insurance policies typically do today. They only covered losses from the peril of fire. And another major difference from most property insurance policies today was in the policy term. Unlike the annual policies that one most commonly encounters today, the policy terms were for 7 years. The premium was also treated differently as a deposit that would be mostly refundable after the expiration of the 7-year term. Certain items would be deducted from the deposit, including a proportional deduction for any losses that were incurred during the policy term, as well as for the expenses of administration. But actually, the expectation was that the vast majority of the deposit would be refunded. Benjamin Franklin himself was one of the first policyholders of the contributorship. On July 4th, 1752, interestingly enough, he purchased 2 policies to cover rental properties that he owned because, aside from all of his other occupations, Benjamin Franklin was also a landlord. The contributorship benefited from the insights and expertise of many of Franklin's associates from the junto. One of them was Phillips Singh, who was one of the directors and also a renowned silversmith. He designed the corporate seal of the contributorship, the 4 interlocking clasped hands, and he also created metal fire marks that would be affixed by policyholders in front of their houses in order to identify the property as being insured by the Philadelphia Contributorship. These fire marks also played a role to encourage volunteer fire companies to respond to fires on properties insured by the contributorship. The contributorship actually donated money to volunteer fire companies in Philadelphia. The fire marks served a signaling role for the volunteer firefighters to give the fire companies an idea that they would be generously rewarded if they put out the fire. An additional incentive stemmed from the fact that many firefighters were themselves contributorship subscribers, and they had an incentive to put out fires on insured properties because the more damage they were able to prevent, the less would be deducted from their premium deposits. However, again, it's important to emphasize that every property was protected, not just the specifically insured properties. Firefighters would not refuse to extinguish a fire just because a building was not insured. In fact, extinguishing the fire was a priority. Seeking some manner of recompense was secondary. If a fire company put out a fire on an uninsured property, perhaps the owner would be approached afterward and a donation would be requested, or the owner would be billed for the costs of extinguishing that fire. But no properties were allowed to burn. 18th century residents of Philadelphia were not so narrow-minded or short-sighted that they would fail to see the great danger involved in allowing one building to burn down when the fire could readily spread to surrounding properties. It was also widely recognized that the contributorship had some important positive effects on fire safety in Philadelphia. Its very existence encouraged firefighters to put out fires more readily on all properties. And so, as a result, the contributorship also had an incentive to make sure that fires did not break out anywhere. The contributorship strongly advocated for basic improvements to fire safety, including improvements to building construction and maintenance. Regular chimney sweeping was a strong point of emphasis during that time because unswept chimneys were the number one cause of house fires. Interestingly enough, the contributorship had no losses at all in 1752 during its first year of operation. And this was in spite 143 policies being issued during that year. So this is an excellent proof of concept for an insurance company that can exist without having any losses for a period of time. In fact, interestingly enough, the first fire insurance company in North America was in that situation for a year. However, during the next year, in 1753, there was a single loss. Extensive damage occurred to a house on Water Street. However, that damage was repaired expeditiously at no out-of-pocket cost to the owner of that property. The repair cost £154. At that time, that sum was far more considerable in real terms than it is today, and indeed, it constituted a third of the contributorship's assets, and in accordance with the principle that premium deposits would be reduced by the amount of any losses, 26.25% of members' premium deposits were deducted in order to pay for this loss. However, it still remained the case that the focus of the contributorship was on prevention, and meticulous surveys and inspections of all houses that were candidates for policy issuance were a part of that loss prevention approach. Another friend of Benjamin Franklin was Samuel Rhodes, a renowned surveyor and architect, also a member of the board of directors of the contributorship. He was diligent in requiring safety-oriented corrections to houses that were inspected and for which policies were issued. One example of such corrections was the requirement of trapdoors to be placed on roofs so as to help fight any emerging roof or chimney fires. And again, there was extensive encouragement of proper chimney sweeping. Indeed, in 1777, when the British military occupied Philadelphia, and most residents were rather impoverished by war and had many other concerns on their minds besides maintenance of their chimneys, the Philadelphia Contributorship actually paid for chimney sweeps to regularly come over to insured members' houses and sweep their chimneys so as to prevent a major fire from breaking out. Furthermore, the Philadelphia Contributorship instituted the rudiments of underwriting and rating guidelines to recognize differences in risk among various properties. through a combination of exclusions and surcharges, various properties considered to be of higher risk were treated accordingly. For example, wooden structures, or apothecary shops, or breweries, all of which were considered to have a greater fire hazard associated with them. The contributorship has also historically been quite reluctant to insure taller structures. Indeed, in the late 19th century, when skyscrapers began to emerge, the contributorship did not agree to extend its policies to cover these new, considerably taller structures. And this generally risk-averse, conservative approach has characterized the contributorship throughout its history, but it is one reason why the contributorship continues to be a going concern today. The contributorship was also aware of the possibility of moral hazard and sought to institute measures to deter the threat of arson. Quite unlike most property insurance policies today, the contributorship actually deliberately set the limits of coverage to be less than the market value of the property, because again, the goal was to prevent total losses from occurring, rather than just compensating the owner for the value of the building if a total loss did take place. And by setting the limits of coverage below the market value of the property, the contributorship helped to prevent various acts of arson, since even if a building did burn down completely, the owner would not recover the full value of that building. Yet another practice pioneered by the contributorship was that of reserving. In 1763, more than a decade after the contributorship's founding, the directors recognized that there was a problem. The policy count had grown sixfold since the inception of the company, but the assets had diminished since the founding because of the practice of returning most of the premium deposits to the policyholders after the expiration of the 7-year term. And likewise, at that time, the interest income that was earned by the contributorship on the deposits was distributed pro rata among the policyholders. So in 1763, the contributorship established a reserve account that was also funded by policyholder deposits and was dedicated specifically for the payment of losses. And indeed, the intent was not to use the principal to pay the losses, but rather to enable the principal to remain within the company and earn interest, and only the interest would be used in company operations. This is different from the way property and casualty insurance reserving is done today. Today, property and casualty insurance reserves are established for losses that have already occurred but have not yet been paid or have not yet been reported to the insurer. This, on the other hand, was a prospective reserve for losses that might occur in the future. And therefore, in that sense, it was a more conservative type of reserve than typical property and casualty insurance reserves are today. Benjamin Franklin himself served as director of the contributorship for a year. In 1753, he found that he needed to step down from that position in order to become the deputy postmaster of British North America. He did a commendable job in that role, where he tripled the frequency of mail deliveries. He did continue to remain involved with the contributorship, including as a policyholder. He purchased a third policy on one of his rental properties in 1763. The contributorship itself remained the sole fire insurance company of North America for the first 32 years of its existence, until 1784. However, eventually, competitors began to arise, as happens in a free market, and began to fill various niches of the market that the contributorship was reluctant to insure. The first competitor to the contributorship was the Mutual Assurance Company, also known as the Green Tree, which arose in 1784 as a direct reaction against a decision by the directors of the contributorship in 1781 to exclude coverage for houses with trees in front of them, because apparently the presence of trees was seen to contribute to the risk of a fire spreading from one structure to another. Many policyholders had trees in front of their homes, and they were not pleased that they were now unable to obtain coverage from the Philadelphia Contributorship, so they decided to form their own competing insurer, which actually continued to exist until 1996 and got its nickname from the fact that it agreed to insure houses with trees in front of them. The contributorship continued to exist and continued to gradually innovate. In 1810, a new product began to be offered, the perpetual fire policy, which did not have an expiration date. The policyholder would provide a larger premium deposit, but that deposit would suffice to provide coverage until or unless either the insurer or the insured initiated cancellation of the policy. The Philadelphia Contributorship has existed up through this very day, and now it exists in a slightly different form. It is a stock corporation owned by a stock holding company, which is owned by a mutual holding company, but in this structure there's still something mutual about it. The contributorship covers a broader territory than it did originally. Its products can be purchased in 4 states, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. And actually, one of its products continues to be a perpetual policy. However, today it covers a broader range of perils. It is a perpetual homeowner's multiple peril insurance policy. And the company continues to be financially strong. As of September 30th, 2015, on a consolidated basis, the contributorship had total assets of $412 million, total liabilities of $189.7 million, and a decent policyholder surplus of $222.3 million. That can be compared to a net written premium in the last 12 months of $122.3 million for a ratio of net written premium to surplus of 0.55, which is generally considered to be quite a conservative, sustainable ratio of premium writings. This company is being prudent. It is not growing aggressively, but it does insure a large volume of business in the 4 states where it provides coverage. Benjamin Franklin himself was involved in other insurance endeavors. He helped with the printing needs of the first life insurance company in North America, with another interesting descriptive 18th century name, the Corporation for the Relief of Poor and Distressed Presbyterian Ministers, and of the Poor and Distressed Widows and Children of Presbyterian Ministers, which was incorporated in 1759. Benjamin Franklin did not found this company, but as a printer, he did assist with advertising and with advocacy. This company's name was later on shortened to the Presbyterian Ministers Fund, and it continued to exist until 1995 when it merged with Provident Mutual Life Insurance Company. At age 82, almost in passing, in a letter to his friend Louis-Guillaume Leveillard, Benjamin Franklin proposed a multi-peril crop insurance program that would reimburse farmers for losses due to insects, weather, and disease. He wrote in this letter, which actually covered many other subjects as well, but this thought occurred to him. I have sometimes thought it might be well to establish an office of insurance for farms against the damage that may occur to them from storms, blights, insects, etc. A small sum paid by a number would repair such losses and prevent much poverty and distress. And interestingly enough, this idea continued to gather interest long after Franklin's time. Occasionally, private insurers attempted crop insurance programs in the late 1800s. The most common implementation has been by national governments in the United States. This occurred in 1938 via the Federal Crop Insurance Corporation. It's not clear from Franklin's letter whether he envisioned crop insurance as being privately provided or provided by a governmental entity. Nonetheless, he is the originator of the idea of an insurance policy that would cover crops against a variety of perils. And it was actually quite within Benjamin Franklin's disposition to originate ideas about far-off future times. Benjamin Franklin could rightly be called a futurist of his era. In my favorite passage from Franklin's writings, a letter that he wrote to Joseph Priestley, another great freethinker of the 18th century, a British chemist who was the discoverer of oxygen gas. Franklin wrote, "The rapid progress true science now makes occasions my regretting sometimes that I was born so soon. It is impossible to imagine the height to which may be carried in 1,000 years the power of man over matter. We may perhaps learn to deprive large masses of their gravity, and give them absolute levity for the sake of easy transport. Agriculture may diminish its labor, and double its produce. All diseases may by sure means be cured, not excepting even that of old age, and our lives lengthened at pleasure, even beyond the antediluvian standard. Oh, that moral science were in as fair a way of improvement, that men would cease to be wolves to one another, and the human beings would at length learn what they now improperly call humanity." And it is impressive what breadth of ideas he was able to contain in that one passage. His first prediction about depriving large masses of their gravity has been fulfilled via air travel and air transport. His prediction about doubling the produce and diminishing the labor of agriculture has been exceeded by approximately an order of magnitude. His third prediction about curing the disease of old age is the one that I want to become true within our lifetimes. And of course, compared to Benjamin Franklin's era, life expectancies have increased considerably by a factor of approximately 2.5. Many once rampant infectious diseases have been contained and in some cases even eradicated. And then Benjamin Franklin offers this lament, which thoughtful individuals in our era should find completely sympathetic, about moral science needing to progress, about the imperative for men to cease being wolves to one another. This passage truly illustrates the 18th century Enlightenment outlook that Benjamin Franklin exhibited, his desire to consider every aspect of the human condition in an interrelated manner, and to see how reason can be deployed in every one of these dimensions in order to improve the human condition and to overcome age-old limitations. With that, he deserves our admiration as a great innovator, not just in insurance or in firefighting, but as a man who harnessed those facets of the human condition and connected them to all others to achieve the progress of humankind. I will leave you with an anachronistic encounter that I had in Kansas City in October 2014. My wife and I were walking along in a shopping center, and there I saw Benjamin Franklin sitting on a bench. I decided to sit down next to him and exchange a few words. Finally, I offer to you the references that were utilized in developing this presentation, including Benjamin Franklin's very own autobiography, published in 1760, and entirely available for free at Project Gutenberg. If you download these slides, you will be able to access each of these readings via live links. Benjamin Franklin is certainly a fascinating individual to explore further, to delve into his life, his inventions, his philosophical ideas, and his contributions to the progress of humankind. Thank you very much.